Welcome back to Under the Microscope. Today, our celebrity guest is Professor Craig MacLean, who is a researcher at the University of Oxford, and is kindly discussing the growing threat of antimicrobial resistance. From what has contributed to this ominous biorisk, to how we can safely continue using antibiotic miracle drugs in a more sustainable way. With a focus on how evolutionary processes have been interwoven with human intervention, Professor MacLean has amassed a plethora of knowledge and experience in research, publications and policy changes to battle the unprecedented future post-antibiotics. I am so grateful to get to speak with him on how he came to study in such a relevant and dynamic field, and would be delighted for you to have a listen as we dive into the future of immunity, medicine and healthcare. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. It's a beautiful late summer day. The sun is shining.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us and seeing your work. It's always fascinated me, and antimicrobial resistance is definitely at the edge of biology. Can you please tell us a little bit about what your current day-to-day responsibilities look like? For example, how much time do you spend in the lab teaching, doing outside of the lab work?
So that's a really good question. So I'm a professor, and so what that means is that my job has, I guess, three main components: teaching, research, and kind of helping to kind of run the university, kind of leadership roles within the university. And I don't have those three activities really blend together. I don't have such a thing as a typical day anymore. So when I was an early career scientist, I'd come in, I'd head straight into the lab, I'd do experiments, or I'd be reading or writing. But now really my activities are much more varied. So there's no such thing as a typical day for me. And that is actually one of the things that I find exciting about this job.
Did you think when you were kind of going into a career in biology or AMR, that's how it would look like?
That's a good question. So I started university thinking that I wanted to go into medicine and as a second degree. But I quickly realized that I wasn't actually that interested in medicine and that I probably wouldn't be a very good doctor. But I became more and more interested in science as my degree went on. And actually my first kind of break came when I got a job as a summer research assistant on a chipmunk behavioral ecology project. And I absolutely loved it. It taught me a lot about science, and it was also spending the whole summer working outdoors, which I really enjoyed. And then I went into a PhD in evolutionary biology that kind of followed on from that. And there we were using microbes to test evolutionary theory, putting bacteria in test tubes, watching how they evolve, and using that to test theories about how evolution works in the real world. And I wasn't really thinking much about AMR at that time. But as time went on, I realized, do you know what? Actually, if we want to study evolutionary adaptation, antibiotics would be a great way to study evolutionary adaptation. And that's how I started working on resistance. And then once I started working on it, I really became more and more interested in understanding AMR for its own sake. That's how I really became active in the field. So I have a very atypical background for an AMR researcher, in that my background is in evolutionary biology, not in microbiology.
Would you feel comfortable talking about, for example, what made you realize, yes, science is for me? Or if someone was trying to choose between a degree or a career in medicine versus taking a science, are there any traits that you think really point someone towards being good in a career in biology instead?
So that's a really good question. So I'm Canadian. In Canada, medicine is something that you do as a second degree. So typically you do an undergrad degree in sciences and then go into medicine as a graduate degree. And it was when I started, so in my biology undergraduate program, probably about half the people were people who wanted to go into medicine. And I quickly realized, I saw how motivated they were to become doctors. And I just realized that I didn't have anything like the same amount of motivation actually to go into medicine. It really made me question whether that was going to be a good path for me, whether I was well suited for that. If I was well suited, how come I wasn't as enthusiastic about it as them? But at the same time, I really enjoyed the science I was learning. And the more that I got into it, the deeper that I got into it, the more I enjoyed it. And so there was that experience that I talked about being a chipmunk behavioral ecology research assistant. And then after that, I got funding. I got a funded scholarship to do a PhD. And it's at that moment that I said, okay, do you know what? I don't know where this is going to lead me, but I'm going to give it a go and try and make this a career.
And about kind of going deep into science, and that's one of the most fascinating parts. But do you actually think that your atypical route, and especially the skills in ecology and evolution, do you think they give you a certain edge in AMR, especially since most people working on it come from diverse fields? Do you think that having that sort of range of biological topics was good, or would you rather have specialized earlier?
No, I think it gives me a unique perspective. And I think that is something that is very helpful in science. So there's some ways in which it's been a kind of an inefficient career trajectory in that, there are a lot of things that you've got to learn. And I think there are probably a lot of mistakes that I've made over the years that somebody with a microbiology background wouldn't have made. But at the end of the day, I think it helped me to bring a novel perspective to the field. And so it's not something that I planned. And I think that's one of the things in science. You have to take the opportunities that are there in front of you. You have to be opportunistic, and if you want to succeed, you have to be willing to take risks.
And things like internship and experimentation are definitely the best way to see if it fits. But was there a particular project that made you realize I want to work on AMR for now? So something that made you shift from evolution as a whole to this has really opened my eyes that this is the topic for me.
Absolutely. It was one experiment. I can remember the experiment that made me think, you know what, I really want to actually really change the direction of the research. So the first work I did on AMR was testing evolutionary theory. There's actually some quite kind of obscure elements of evolutionary theory that I thought were really fascinating, and that a kind of pretty small group of evolutionary biologists think are really fascinating. And then when I started working on AMR, and especially one experiment where we saw about how antibiotic resistance becomes more and more stable in populations every time you use an antibiotic, I realized, okay, the evolutionary biology behind this is pretty cool, but actually there's a really clear take-home message from this. This is the type of message that could maybe actually help to change how people use antibiotics. And that I think is the moment where I decided, okay, do you know what? I'm going to go kind of all in on this and really try and reorient my research program.
And obviously, in the media and the public have probably seen stories about the growing threat of antibiotic resistance. But could you
Yeah.
give like a 2 or 3 sentence summary of why it's a problem now and why we really need to be working on this at the moment?
2 or 3 sentences is a big ask, but this will be my go. So, antibiotic resistance is one of the biggest challenges that humanity is going to face in the 21st century. So, for most of human history, bacterial infections have been a leading cause of disease and death. And the discovery of antibiotics really fundamentally changed this. By some estimates, it's increased average human lifespan by about 20 years. But what's happened is that the widespread use of antibiotics has driven the spread of resistance. And at the same time, the rate at which we've discovered new antibiotics has really dried up. And this has created a kind of perfect storm for a global healthcare crisis that has been compounded by growing human populations, growing use of antibiotics in agriculture, and most recently, climate change.
Really interesting. I'd love to know more about how climate change plays into it because it's definitely not publicized as much in the media.
Yeah, so I think that we're starting to see some hints of this. For example, things like increased flooding, increased seasonal flooding in parts of the world, and that has so one of the biggest ways and most effective ways of combating infectious disease is improved sanitation, keeping water we drink, the food we eat separate from human waste and animal waste. And one of the things that flooding does is it mixes it all around, and that creates more increased infection, increased exposure actually to AMR bacteria. And it's a clear case where we can see that climate change, which is pretty to lead to increased flooding, will probably exacerbate AMR.
And something like flooding and sanitation, that's obviously disproportional in where it affects in the world. but most agricultural antibiotic use or healthcare antibiotic use is typically found in clusters of more developed medical systems. So do you think that the sort of approach that we do, but now its consequences are felt by other communities, do you think it shows that it really needs to be an international, unified way of dealing with it rather than each country for themselves?
Yeah. So the challenges of AMR are different from country to country. And this is kind of reflected by the fact that different countries have different AMR action plans. But at the same time, it's clear that AMR is a global problem. The movement of people, the movement of food, et cetera, moves resistances from between different parts of the world. So the idea that you can solve AMR in any one country without addressing AMR globally is incorrect. And
In terms of the scientific rate of bacteria and microbes developing resistance, is there anything that is currently being done in the countries, so the use of their agriculture, that you think is the number one leading factor for why it's suddenly become such a big problem and the rate of it has also increased?
Well, I guess I don't really think that AMR has suddenly become a big problem. I think it's getting much more attention in the press. But I think there's a really interesting kind of comparisons and contrasts that you can they can make between AMR and COVID. And COVID was this kind of very spiky pandemic that shot up, that changed very quickly. And AMR is kind of the opposite. It's a slow and creeping pandemic. It's something it's been getting worse year on year, rather than there's been this kind of massive sudden acceleration. I think it's more the awareness of it and in both the public and in the scientific community that has really increased in the last 10 years.
Yeah, since I think when antibiotics were first developed, the life cycle of when it's still majorly effective was around 10 years. And now I think it's estimated at most 1 to 2 if an antibiotic is reduced to mass market. Do you agree with there's this consensus among some AMR researchers that at our current trajectory by 2050 we'll be in a post-antibiotic era where most antibiotics we currently have or new antibiotics that we develop won't be effective against most of the diseases that they currently are? Do you agree with this trajectory? Do you think it's sooner, later, it'll never happen, it'll look different?
So you asked me to glare into my crystal ball and predict the future. So I certainly think that the antibiotics that we have now, I don't have much hope for them being useful by 2050. I think that at the same time, so things are definitely going to get worse. I think at the same time, I'm cautiously optimistic, actually, that people are now thinking there's no kind of one silver bullet solution to this problem. I think that's a very kind of 20th century way of thinking about this. And I think that the solutions to AMR are going to be very multifactorial. And I think that really what we're seeing now is actually the development of some interesting and new approaches to treating bacterial infections that are hopefully going to be very helpful in the longer run.
Are there any particular therapies or treatments that you think look as part of promising candidates that may be used either along with or instead of antibiotics?
Yeah, so I'm going to highlight two. There are lots of them. Actually, I'm going to highlight three, basically. One is we're seeing improvements in diagnostic technologies so that we can see, for example, when somebody has a bacterial infection as opposed to a viral infection. And so use antibiotics in a more appropriate, targeted way. That's going to help us. Another thing that I want to highlight is something that I work on at the moment, which is using phage. So these are viruses that infect bacteria. We've known for a long time that this can be successful. And I think that there's a lot of progress that is being made in this area, and that that phage will contribute in the long run to helping solve this problem. And the final thing that I want to actually talk about is vaccines. So the COVID pandemic has really highlighted the incredible utility that vaccines can have. And I think there are actually there's some bacteria for which we have vaccines. And I think that there's some really interesting developments that are underway to make new and better and more vaccines to stop infections happening in the first place.
And of course, there are these large scale things, so developing new therapies and vaccines. Do you think that, for example, science should have more of a role in stepping in and having more of a power in the regulations and policy?
Yeah. So I think, it's government and organizations like the NHS set policies, but it's always going to be down, for example, to doctors to make those decisions. And I think that what better diagnostic tools, for example, are going to do is they're going to help doctors to make more informed decisions. Because we know that unnecessary antibiotic use is not good for people, it's not good for individual patients, and that it's obviously not good for society as a whole. So I think, I guess that's what I would say. I think that it's always going to be down to doctors to make those decisions about what's best for their patient.
And do you think that scientists currently researching AMR are, I guess, believe AMR being a prominent and relevant topic?
So this is a good question. Are you asking, does AMR need its Greta Thunberg?
I'm thinking more, for example, climate change or that smoking correlates really strongly with cancer. These are ideas that took a long time for media and companies to start listening to, and that's the norm. And antibiotic use is still kind of highlighted as a harmless thing to take to prevent bad side effects. For now, there's not that much talk about AMR.
Well, I think you have to be very careful actually around the messaging with antibiotics, because antibiotics obviously can have a hugely positive impact when people have bacterial infections. As I said, some estimates are that antibiotics have increased human lifespan by up to 20 years. So you absolutely don't want to make people afraid of taking antibiotics. I think and so this is one reason why. Do you know what I mean? So smoking, for example, is always bad, but taking antibiotics is sometimes going to be incredibly good for your health, and other times it's going to be unnecessary and possibly detrimental. So I think that the messaging around that to the public it's more complicated, complex, and I think that it's, for whatever reasons, and I'm not an expert in communicating science, but I think it's some of the concepts behind AMR have been a little bit more difficult to communicate.
Do you think that behind the scenes of the communications, so technical lab studies, do you think that AMR as a research field is currently under-researched? Does it need more researchers? Is there an influx of people, or is it a neglected field? Does it get enough funding? I mean, no amount of science ever gets enough funding, but do you think that compared to other prominent threats in biology, that people are giving it the attention that it needs?
I think certainly within the scientific community, I think so. I think there's been a huge increase in the kind of interest in the field. I get emails from young scientists who are interested in AMR every day. I think there's a lot of interest. And I think within the scientific community, there's a lot of visibility.
And do you think, is there a particular part of AMR research, for example, a lab experiment or an out-of-lab experiment that someone in A-level or undergrad could do to help, that just data collection that desperately just needs more people working on it to be able to then be used for the bigger picture?
That's a good question. There are some citizen scientist initiatives out there. I think for students who are interested in doing experiments in AMR, then at a kind of A level, I think that is a little bit more limited by the facilities that they would have access to, and also the health and safety aspects of working on antibiotic resistance. But there's some citizen scientist initiatives, one called Bash the Bug that some colleagues of mine developed, and that's where absolutely people can help out. People can collect data that's used for studies. But that's a really good question. I think that perhaps there hasn't been enough of that, of citizen science, and it might be something that could contribute more to the field in the future.
And do you think, obviously, there's no doubting that AMR is one of the biggest growing threats, but compared to other potential existential or really large-scale risks, such as the danger of misinformation with AI or bioweapons, pandemics, whether natural or man-made, what made you choose AMR as both kind of a field that you're interested in, that you've touched on, but also as a field that's important for the world today and something that could potentially save lives?
Well, as I said, my background is really in evolutionary biology, and this is just an incredible example of evolution in action. It's, I think, some of the kind of fastest, resistance is some of the fastest evolution that we can probably think of. And so I thought, well, this is great. It gives me an opportunity to use this toolkit that I've learned to think about evolutionary biology and to apply that to a problem that is very important actually for humanity, and also scientifically very interesting.
Are there any particular experiments in the history of AMR that are to do with the science of how it evolves that you think are really worth noting in the field and really interesting?
One of my favorite experiments, and this is an experiment I think that was done in the 1950s or 1960s, was actually an experiment that was done to understand mutation and whether mutation is a random process or whether mutation is a directed process. So in this case, say, for example, do mutations occur randomly and then some of them increase antibiotic resistance, or does exposure to antibiotics make antibiotic resistance mutations happen? And the experiment was very elegant, very simple, and what it showed very clearly is that mutations happen at random, and then selection occurs, and it's it's just a really fundamental, simple, and elegant experiment. It's called a fluctuation test, and that's a favorite kind of pioneering experiment of mine.
And it's amazing. And even the kind of nitty-gritty of biology, for example, phage therapy, they're not really alive or dead. But what are your thoughts on the idea of not just the bacteria evolving to be able to resist the phages, but potentially some studies coming out that the phages themselves could then evolve to then once again be able to infect or to damage the bacteria?
That's right. So that clearly happens. You can watch that happening in front of you. It happens very quickly, actually, and it's one of the kind of pros of using phage. It's not the only advantage. The other thing that is there's an incredible diversity of phage that are out there, and I think that harnessing that diversity, something that we could be doing a better job of, and using that incredible diversity of phage that are out there to fight bacterial to either prevent bacterial infections, which is I think what they'll probably be more useful for, or in some cases to treat them. I think that's a really promising approach.
It's amazing studying viruses such as phages that they could give us inklings of what was early life like, how did cells come about, but also the evolution of the cell wall. And so it might have a higher life cycle. So what do you think about that?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the areas where actually you really rapidly see that coevolution happening is in changes to the bacterial cell surface, especially something called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, to stop phage from binding, and then phage tail proteins evolving the ability to bind to these new cell surface structures. So there are things like the bacterial cell wall that on the one hand seem, kind of ancient and very highly conserved, but also have some components that are actually capable of evolving very quickly when selective pressures are strong.
And it all plays out in front of our eyes. I think that a lot of people have the view that evolution is static or very historical, but what do you think are some of your favorite examples to use to show just how, I guess, dynamic evolution can be? For example, in the recent years, not just in bacteria, but have you noticed any other evolutionary changes that have happened in what seems like the blink of an eye?
Well, so that's when we get outside of my area of expertise, but I think there are, a number of examples now of rapid evolution in wild populations of animals and plants. Evolution is, you're right, that most of the time evolutionary change is probably slow, but there's certainly cases where rapid evolution happens when there's the right combination of strong selective pressure and then genetic variation in phenotypes that are relevant to that selective pressure. So it does happen quickly sometimes.
They did genome sequencing of some of the rats and pigeons in the metro subways of America, I think, and
Yeah.
found that there were enough base changes that potentially they were a different species and could no longer interbreed. So in just, I think, 15 years since the station was
Yeah.
built, because of the isolation and the different diets and the exposure to light, they have speciated completely. And it's just amazing how quickly it happens, but also humans were the catalyst in that. We put roads, we cut down forests, we usually not quite speed up evolution, but we increase the likelihood of populational separation. Do you think that antibiotic resistance is something that would have do you think that it would have kept growing as a rate if humans hadn't started using antibiotics? So just in the natural kingdom between fungi or different bacteria, Or do you think that the only reason AMR is an actual threat is because of human intervention?
So I think you've brought up something that we didn't talk about before, and that's that AMR is natural, that we now understand that microbes live in these kind of densely packed communities where there's a lot of competition, and actually, in truth, where they do all kinds of horrible, nasty things to each other. And making antibiotics to kill each other is one of the ways in which microbes compete with each other. And most of the antibiotic resistance genes that are out there now really or a lot of the resistance that's there has come from the movement of resistance genes from environmental bacteria into pathogens. So I think one of the big unknown questions is, if we look at all of the antibiotics in the world, how many of them come from human use of antibiotics versus how many of them come from natural antibiotics? I don't actually know. I don't think anybody actually knows that number. So what I would say, what impact humans have had on resistance in the environment, or human use of antibiotics has had on resistance in the environment, is maybe not that clear. What is clear, if we look about kind of the earth as a whole, but what is clear is that in pathogenic bacteria and in bacteria that are associated with us, so I include pathogens, but also kind of harmless or even friendly bacteria that live in places like our gut microbiome, that our use of antibiotics in medicine has really changed resistance there. It's massively increased antibiotic resistance for human-associated bacteria.
And I guess that's the nuance of biology. Antibiotics are both good or bad depending on the situation. Antibiotic resistance can both mean that you can't recover from an illness as easily, but it also means that a bacteria can continue living when an antibiotic is introduced. Do you think that there's a particular antibiotic resistant strain of a certain pathogen that looks like it might become a very big threat in maybe the next 5 years? So a particular disease like tuberculosis or MRSA or C. diff that you think will kind of devastate a community or a population at its current trajectory?
Oh my goodness. Well, if you look, so the UN releases these kind of threat indications, and there's some the most recent ones actually show that there's some bacteria, especially one called Acinetobacter baumannii, that is really increasing as a pathogen, and that's a bacterium around which there's quite a bit of concern, basically. But if you ask me to look into my crystal ball and say, what are going to be the biggest problems, I think it's going to be more of an increase in overall resistance rather than some new superbug coming along. So that would be my overall bet, would be that it's the same bugs, but the problem getting worse and worse, more AMR.
If someone wanted to reduce AMR and wanted to be working on projects to try and prevent it, what do you think is the most promising thing that they could do? So maybe they just finished their bachelor's or master's, they're thinking, do I do a PhD? Do I go into policy? I'm interested in AMR, working on reducing it, working on studying it. I want to make an impact. What do you think you would recommend that they do if they just wanted to work on the most promising techniques in AMR?
I would suggest that they work on what they find most interesting and fun. As I said, there isn't going to be one silver bullet solution to this. It's a complex and multifactorial problem. So, I think all of these different things, and that really addressing this crisis is going to need technological innovation. It's going to need new policy. It's going to need new ways of working, new ways of analyzing data. So all of these paths can help contribute if that's somebody's goal, and that they should do what they find fun.
And zooming out a little bit, let's say someone's in finished GCSEs, starting A levels, they want to study biology as a whole at university and they want to stay up to date. Is there a particular resource or a particular activity that you'd recommend, such as a book, an article, a podcast, that would kind of set them up to have an interest in biology and to continue learning more about the field?
That's a tricky one. So I would definitely say to read. So things like New Scientist, for example, are really good for people who are at that level. There is this really big disconnect between this kind of professional scientific literature, which are these kind of hyper technical papers that really are kind of accessible to people from second year university onwards, And there's a really big gap between that and what's out there for the public. And there isn't any one book that I can point to, that I would say, oh, anybody who's interested in AMR has to read this.
Were there any particular books or articles, not necessarily about AMR, that you read or came across in your journey that you just loved? So anything biology related that you thought, this is really, really fun?
I remember when I started reading some of those Richard Dawkins books. So things like books like The Selfish Gene and Climbing Mount Improbable, that I really found fascinating, and The Extended Phenotype as well. So I think that those are really good, well-written books, that I think are classics for a reason. They're fantastic scientific works.
Yes, there are just so many amazing things that really, to be honest, GCSE and A-level biology is so black and white, and reading these books really shows you the nuance of everything, and it's definitely very interesting. So as we wrap up, the final question is, what is an unconventional piece of advice that you've got in your life, whether it's academic or just life in general, that you think has really resonated with you and that you would tell other people who may be doing academic work or just life in general that you think would help them too?
This isn't a piece of advice that I was given, but it's a piece of advice that I would give to people. If you're interested in science, do what you find interesting and what you find fun. If it's not fun, you're not, then you're not doing it right. That's my advice. And I think that to fault, and do what you enjoy doing and what you find to be meaningful and fulfilling.
That's very, very good advice. And science is so diverse that it should have something fun for everyone. Very, very much for talking to me today. And that was our celebrity.